They tried to hang the fat widow, but the mountain man stood in front of the rope. The crowd had gathered with vengeance in their hearts, unaware that justice would take an unexpected turn that day. Before the sun set on that dusty town, lives would change forever and secrets would come to light. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The torches cast long, menacing shadows across the village square as Agatha stood beneath the ancient oak, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her flesh. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through autumn leaves, accusations of witchcraft and misfortune hanging in the air as heavily as the noose that swayed above her head. The widow's eyes remained downcast, her substantial frame trembling not from the evening chill, but from the weight of their collective hatred. Matthias Eldridge stepped forward, his weathered face illuminated by flickering flame as he raised his hands to silence the murmurs. "The widow has brought famine to our fields and sickness to our children," the elder proclaimed, his voice carrying authority honed through years of unchallenged rule. "Tonight, we cleanse our valley of her curse." The crowd roared its approval, pressing closer as Matthias gestured for the executioner to prepare the rope. Agatha closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer, as the noose was lowered toward her neck. No one had spoken in her defense. No one had dared. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. The villagers parted involuntarily as Silas Blackthorne emerged from the gathering darkness, his tall frame silhouetted against the torchlight. Without a word, the mountain man positioned himself directly between Agatha and the executioner, his broad shoulders squared and his stance unmovable as the peaks themselves. "Move aside, outsider," Matthias commanded, his confidence faltering slightly before Silas's unwavering gaze. "This is village business." "No," Silas replied, the single word resonating across the suddenly silent square. "This is murder." Darla pushed to the front of the crowd, her innkeeper's apron still dusted with flour. "She's cursed us all," the woman shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger. "The crops wither where she walks." Silas didn't flinch. "Show me proof," he demanded, his deep voice carrying a challenge that none seemed eager to accept. "Or is fear your only evidence?" Matthias's face darkened with rage. The elder was unaccustomed to defiance, particularly before the entire village. "You dare question our traditions, our justice?" he sputtered, his authority visibly cracking. "I question cruelty disguised as justice," Silas answered, reaching behind him to take Agatha's bound hands. With one swift motion, he sliced through her restraints with a hunting knife. The crowd surged forward, then retreated, uncertain, as Silas guided the widow away from the oak. No one moved to stop them, not even Matthias, though his eyes promised retribution. As they departed the square, Helmi, the folk healer, watched from the shadows, a small smile playing across her lips. Nearby, Gregor the woodcutter lowered his gaze when Agatha passed, his heart pounding with unspoken devotion. And throughout the dispersing crowd, whispers of a different kind began to spread, questions about Matthias's judgment and the courage of the solitary mountain man who had defied them all. The mountain path twisted upward through dense pines, each step taking Agatha further from the hatred below. Silas walked ahead, his broad shoulders hunched against the evening chill, occasionally glancing back to ensure she followed. The widow's breath came in labored puffs as she climbed, her sighs making the ascent difficult, but the fear of what lay behind pushed her forward more effectively than any encouragement. "Not much farther," Silas muttered, the first words he'd spoken since they'd fled the square. When they finally reached the cabin, Agatha paused at the threshold. The structure was sturdy but small, built of rough-hewn logs and sealed with pine pitch. Inside, a single room housed everything the mountain man needed: a stone hearth, a narrow bed, shelves lined with preserved foods and herbs. "It's not much," he said, gesturing awkwardly, "but they won't come up here after dark." Agatha nodded, unable to speak through her exhaustion and relief. The mountain man moved about the space with practiced efficiency, stoking the embers in the hearth until flames licked upward. He pulled thick furs from a trunk and offered them to her without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping the pelts around her shoulders. The trembling that had seized her body since the moment the rope touched her neck began to subside, replaced by an uncertain calm. "Are you hungry?" Silas asked, already reaching for a pot. Down in the valley, Darla's inn buzzed with excited whispers. The innkeeper moved between tables, her voice carrying as she refilled tankards. "Always knew there was something unnatural about her," Darla declared to eager ears. "A woman that size, living alone after her husband passed, eating enough for 3 while the rest of us work our fingers raw? Mark my words, it's a curse she brings." The patrons nodded, fear and superstition finding fertile ground in their minds. One man suggested the widow had bewitched Silas, another that her hunger would bring famine to their stores. The following morning, Silas descended alone to the village, needing supplies. He kept his head down, but couldn't avoid hearing the whispers that followed him through the square. At the trading post, he gathered flour and salt, ignoring the stares. "Heard you've taken in the widow," the merchant said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Brave man or foolish one?" Silas said nothing, merely placed his coins on the counter. Back at the cabin, he found Agatha had swept the floor and organized his meager belongings. Something about seeing her there, making herself useful despite everything, strengthened his resolve. The mountain man had never considered himself anyone's protector before, had valued his solitude above all else. But as he watched her carefully mending a torn shirt, he knew he'd made the right choice. The village could keep their suspicions and their rope. Up here, at least for now, they were beyond reach. The meeting house door crashed open, sending a blast of cold air through the room. Silas stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale winter light, snow dusting his broad shoulders. The gathered villagers fell silent as the mountain man strode toward Matthias, his footsteps heavy on the wooden planks. "Show us your proof," Silas demanded, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet hall. "What evidence do you have that Agatha has brought any curse upon this valley?" Matthias rose slowly from his carved chair at the head of the council table, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The elder adjusted his fur-lined cloak with deliberate care before addressing the intruder. "We need no proof beyond what our eyes can see," he declared, gesturing to the other council members. "The widow's presence disturbs our order. Her size alone speaks of excess and greed. And you," he pointed at Silas, "an outsider questioning our ways only confirm the danger." Several villagers nodded in agreement, while others looked down, unwilling to meet Silas's gaze. From her position near the back wall, Agatha watched, her hands clutched tightly together beneath her shawl. "Traditions built on lies deserve to be questioned," Silas countered, stepping closer. "You would hang a woman on nothing but whispers and fear." Matthias's face darkened. "This valley has survived for generations by following our customs. Those who cannot respect them have no place here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Continue this defiance, mountain man, and you'll find yourself banished beyond the pass before the next snow." Helmi, the folk healer, rose from her seat. "Perhaps we should consider—" "Silence!" Matthias slammed his fist on the table. "The council has spoken." Silas stood unmoved, his eyes locked with the elders. "Your threats mean nothing to me. I've lived alone before and can do so again, but I will not stand by while you condemn an innocent woman." The tension in the room was palpable as villagers shifted uncomfortably on their benches. Darla, seated near Matthias, whispered urgently in his ear, her eyes darting suspiciously toward Agatha. As Silas turned to leave, he caught Agatha's gaze across the room. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that her fate had become irrevocably entwined with his. This stubborn protector had drawn a line in the snow between old ways and justice, and there would be no easy peace in the valley now. Outside, as they walked in silence through the falling snow, Agatha finally spoke. "You've made yourself their enemy because of me." Silas looked at the path ahead, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "No," he said simply, "they made themselves enemies of truth long before we met." The summer solstice brought warmth to the valley, thawing even the coldest hearts as villagers prepared for the annual bonfire feast. Cowering pyres of seasoned wood stood ready in the village square, waiting for nightfall when they would blaze against the darkening sky. Children wove flower crowns while adults prepared tables laden with bread, cheese, and summer ale, a celebration meant to ensure good fortune for the coming harvest. Agatha hesitated at the edge of the forest path, watching the festivities from a distance. Despite Silas's warnings to stay away, she had made her decision. The widow smoothed her simple dress, took a deep breath, and stepped into the square with quiet dignity. The music faltered, conversations died. All eyes turned to the large woman who dared enter their sacred celebration. "The curse-bearer comes to poison our feast," Darla announced loudly from behind her serving table. The innkeeper's voice carried across the square, igniting whispers that spread like wildfire through the crowd. Yet Agatha continued forward, her movements slow but deliberate as she approached the central bonfire. When the musicians reluctantly resumed playing, she began to sway gently to the rhythm, remembering steps from happier times. From the shadows emerged Silas, his tall frame unmistakable as he positioned himself beside Agatha. The mountain man's presence created a small island of protection in the hostile sea of villagers. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes constantly scanned the crowd for threats. "She'll bring drought to our fields," someone shouted. A small stone flew through the air, striking Silas's shoulder instead of its intended target. He didn't flinch, merely shifted closer to Agatha. "Stand aside, mountain man," called another voice. "Let the widow face what she deserves." More stones followed, but Silas absorbed each blow without complaint, a human shield against the village's fear and hatred. Agatha continued her dance, tears glistening in her eyes, but her head held high. At the edge of the square, Soren had set up a small stall adorned with colorful fabric. The merchant displayed an array of trinkets, crude wooden amulets, and glass beads on leather cords. "Protection against the widow's curse," he called out, jingling a pouch of coins. "3 silver pieces for guaranteed safety. Ward off misfortune before it strikes your home." Villagers flocked to his stall, exchanging hard-earned coins for worthless charms, their faces tight with fear. Helmi watched from nearby, shaking her head at the foolishness, but saying nothing. As darkness fell and the bonfires roared to life, Agatha and Silas remained, defiant in their shared solitude. The widow's dance became a statement. She would not be erased, would not be driven away. And beside her, steady as the mountains themselves, Silas stood guard, his presence declaring that fear would not win this night. For 3 days after the summer bonfire feast, not a single cloud dared cross the valley sky. The crops, once lush with promise, now curled and browned under the merciless sun. Farmers stood in their fields, hats clutched to chests, watching helplessly as the earth cracked beneath their feet. "It's her," whispered a woman at the well, eyes darting toward the mountain path. "Agatha's presence has angered the spirits." The accusation spread faster than the drought itself. By midday, small groups had gathered outside Darla's inn, their voices growing louder with each empty water bucket. "My barley won't last another week," lamented one farmer, his weathered face lined with worry. "Not since that widow returned to the feast." Darla emerged from her establishment, wiping hands on her apron. "I warned you all," she announced, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Her size alone is an affront to natural balance. The land suffers when excess walks among us." Matthias seized upon the growing unrest. calling an emergency meeting in the village square. Standing beneath the ancient oak, the very tree where the rope had once swung for Agatha, the elder raised his hands for silence. "The signs are clear," he proclaimed. "Our fields wither while she thrives in the mountain man's cabin. This drought is no accident of nature." From the edge of the crowd, Helmi pushed forward, her collection of herbs clutched tightly in one hand. The folk healer's voice, though soft, carried surprising strength. "You speak without knowledge," she challenged Matthias. "Agatha knows the old ways. Her grandmother taught her fertility rites that once blessed these very fields. In times past, widows were honored for such wisdom, not condemned." A murmur rippled through the villagers. Some nodded, remembering years when drought had come and gone long before Agatha's troubles began. Matthias's face darkened. "Listen to yourselves," he scoffed. "Helmi speaks of fertility rites and ancient knowledge. What is that if not an admission of witchcraft?" "That's not what Helmi began," but Darla was already moving through the crowd. "The healer confirms it," the innkeeper declared. "Agatha practices the old rituals, but instead of blessing, she brings curse. Her rites have turned against us." The villagers shifted uncomfortably, torn between desperate fear and lingering doubt. A young mother clutched her child closer. An old man spat in the dust. "Perhaps," suggested Helmi, making one final attempt, "we should ask for her help rather than her banishment." But her words fell on parched ground. As the meeting dispersed, the villagers cast anxious glances toward the mountain, where Silas's cabin stood as a distant reminder of the woman they had chosen to blame for the dying land beneath their feet. The pine logs crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across Silas's cabin walls. Agatha Winters sat at the rough-hewn table, her large hands working deftly with dried herbs and roots. The mountain man watched with quiet fascination as she combined ingredients he'd always overlooked. "My mother taught me these recipes," she explained, crumbling dried mushrooms into a pot. "When winter comes harsh, this broth will keep strength in your bones for 3 days on just 1 cup. Silas nodded appreciatively. "I've survived 20 winters alone, but never with food that good." The widow smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen cross her face since pulling her from beneath the hanging tree. Her knowledge of preservation methods far surpassed his own. Smoking meats with specific wood combinations, fermenting vegetables in clay pots sealed with pine resin, and crafting tinctures from mountain flowers that would ward off winter coughs. "You're full of surprises," he admitted, watching her stir the pot with practiced movements. "Surprising enough to be accused of witchcraft," Agatha replied, but there was no bitterness in her tone, only a wry humor that caught Silas off guard. Her unexpected laughter filled the cabin, transforming the space that had known only solitude for so long. As dawn broke the following morning, Silas spotted a figure moving cautiously through the pines. He reached for his axe, but Agatha placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It's Gregor," she whispered. "He comes every 3rd day." The woodcutter approached with hunched shoulders, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He carried a sack of flour and a bundle of split logs, far more than one man needed for himself. Without a word, he placed them near the cabin door, then hesitated, his eyes seeking Agatha through the window. "He won't come inside," she explained, too afraid of what Matthias would do if word got back to the village. Silas watched the silent exchange, Agatha's nod of gratitude, Gregor's longing gaze. The woodcutter's devotion was plain to see, yet his courage failed him when it came to declaring it openly. "He loved my bread," she said softly after Gregor disappeared into the trees. "Before all this started, he would find excuses to pass my cottage when the ovens were hot." That evening, as they shared a meal enriched by Agatha's knowledge and Gregor's secret provisions, Silas realized something had changed. His cabin, once a fortress of isolation, had become a sanctuary for 3 outcasts bound by fragile threads of loyalty and need. "They can't touch us here," he said, more to himself than to her. Agatha looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. They don't need to touch us. Fear does their work for them. But as the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in white silence, the mountains stood guard over their small rebellion against cruelty, and for now, that was enough. The afternoon sky darkened ominously as Agatha stood outside Silas's cabin, her eyes fixed on the gathering clouds above the mountain peaks. She traced their patterns with her finger, following the swirling dance of gray and black against the horizon. "Rain's coming," she said with quiet certainty. "Heavy, but not destructive. The barley fields need it desperately." Silas watched her, skepticism etched across his weathered face. The valley had suffered weeks of drought, the soil cracking beneath the relentless sun. The mountain man had seen many predict weather and fail, yet something in her confidence gave him pause. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, leaning against the cabin's wooden doorframe. Agatha smiled, her eyes never leaving the sky. "My grandmother taught me to read the clouds. See how they gather there, above the tallest peak? When they curl like that, rain follows within hours. By nightfall, the first drops began to fall. By morning, gentle rain had soaked the parched earth, saving the barley field that belonged to Gregor and 3 other families. The crops, which had yellowed and begun to wither, would survive after all. Word spread quickly through the village. The woodcutter, relieved beyond measure, brought a small sack of flour to the mountain cabin in gratitude. "You saved our harvest," he whispered to Agatha, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting to be seen. "I cannot thank you enough." After Gregor departed, Silas regarded his houseguest with newfound respect. "You knew exactly what would happen," he said. "Not a question, but an acknowledgement." "Knowledge isn't magic," she replied, kneading dough with flour-covered hands. "It's observation and memory." In the village square, however, Matthias and Darla spun a different tale. The elder gathered concerned villagers at the inn, his voice low and ominous. "The rain came too conveniently," Matthias declared, pounding his fist on the wooden table. "Natural rains don't appear precisely when needed. The widow has unnatural knowledge." Darla nodded vigorously, serving drinks to thirsty patrons. "I've always said there was something wrong about her. Controlling the weather now? What next?" Helmi, seated in the corner, finally spoke up. "Or perhaps she simply understands nature better than most of us. The rain saved your barley too, Matthias." The innkeeper shot the healer a venomous look. "Don't defend her witchcraft." Outside, farmers inspected their revived crops with relief, even as they whispered suspicions about the woman who had predicted their salvation. Their livelihoods preserved by the very person they scorned, they found themselves caught between gratitude and fear. Back at the cabin, Agatha gazed at the clearing sky, unaware that her simple knowledge of weather patterns had only deepened the village's mistrust. Beside her, Silas watched silently, his determination to protect her growing with each passing day. Autumn painted the valley in crimson and gold, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The Woodcutters' Guild, one of the oldest institutions in the village, prepared for their annual contest with solemn reverence. Logs were arranged in precise rows along the rocky slopes, axes sharpened until they gleamed in the slanting sunlight. Silas arrived just as the competition was beginning. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. The mountain man rarely participated in village traditions. He stood tall among them, his weathered hands gripping his own axe, the handle worn smooth from years of honest labor. Several guild members exchanged uneasy glances, but none could deny him entry according to the ancient rules. "The outsider thinks he can best true woodsman," whispered one villager to another, loud enough for Silas to hear. The contest began with the ceremonial horn blast. One by one, competitors approached the massive logs. demonstrating their skill and strength. Each swing of the axe sent chips flying, the sharp crack echoing across the slopes. Gregor performed admirably, his technique refined from years of practice, earning approving nods from the elders. When Silas's turn came, he approached the log without ceremony. His movements were efficient, almost graceful, despite his size. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, each strike precise and powerful. The wood split cleanly under his blade, faster than anyone had managed thus far. When he finished, standing beside the perfectly cleaved log, even his critics could not deny his skill. "He's won fair," announced the guildmaster, presenting Silas with the traditional wreath of oak leaves. That evening at Darla's inn, the atmosphere was tense. Matthias sat by the hearth, his face sour as vinegar as he addressed the gathered woodcutters. "Did you not see how the mountain dweller split that log?" the elder asked, swirling the contents of his cup. "No honest woodsman works that way. These are mountain tricks, learned from who knows where." "But he followed all our rules," Gregor protested quietly, earning a sharp glare from Darla as she served fresh drinks. "Rules can be followed while spirit is broken," Matthias countered. "Remember, these outsiders bring strange ways. Today it's woodcutting. Tomorrow it could be worse. The widow already threatens our harvests with her presence." The healer, Helmi, who had been quietly drinking her tea in the corner, shook her head but said nothing. The divide was growing deeper with each passing day. Up in the cabin on the mountainside, Agatha waited with a pot of stew simmering over the fire. When Silas returned with the victor's wreath, she smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "They can't deny your honest work," she said, ladling the fragrant stew into wooden bowls. "They'll try," he replied, hanging the wreath on a peg by the door. "And they'll use it against you somehow. Always do." Both knew were caught in a battle neither had chosen, with the village's trust hanging in the balance. The golden hues of autumn painted the valley as harvest season descended upon the village, according to tradition dating back generations. The village widow was tasked with baking the first ceremonial loaf, a sacred duty that blessed the harvest and ensured prosperity for all. Agatha had prepared for this responsibility, gathering herbs and grains as her husband's widow should. But 3 days before the ceremony, Matthias stood at the meeting-house steps, his voice carrying across the square. "The widow Agatha shall not touch our sacred bread," he proclaimed, fingers curling into fists. "Her hands carry misfortune, and her presence would taint our harvest. The council has decided." Word reached the mountain cabin by nightfall. Agatha sat motionless by the hearth, her face illuminated by dancing flames. "They've taken everything else," she whispered. "Now they take my duty as well." Silas paced the wooden floor, his footsteps heavy with anger. "Bake it anyway," he finally said, stopping before her. "Not for their approval, but because it's yours to do." The next morning, the mountain man returned from the village with a sack of the finest flour, nutmeg, and honey, gifts secretly provided by Gregor, who had risked Matthias's wrath to ensure Agatha could fulfill her rightful role. In the cabin's warmth, Agatha's hands worked the dough with practiced precision. She hummed ancient melodies as she kneaded, incorporating dried berries and seeds, her movements a dance passed down through generations of valley widows. Silas watched in silent admiration as she shaped the loaf and marked it with traditional patterns. The bread baked in the stone oven, filling the cabin with an aroma so enticing it seemed to drift down the mountainside on its own accord. When completed, the golden brown loaf sat cooling on the table, its crust crackling softly. "Now what?" she asked, her eyes reflecting both pride and sorrow. "Now we share it," Silas replied, wrapping the bread carefully in clean cloth. Under cover of darkness, he traveled to the edge of the village, where Helmi waited. The healer took the bundle with reverent hands. "I'll see it reaches those who still honor the old ways," she promised. Throughout the night, villagers came to Helmi's door one by one. Each received a small piece of Agatha's bread, eating it in secret, away from Matthias's watchful eyes. Darla refused, of course, but even some of her regular patrons accepted their share with whispered thanks. By morning, something remarkable had occurred. The fields seemed to shimmer with unusual vitality. The first wheat cut that day yielded more grain than expected. As the harvest progressed, the bounty continued, crops abundant, fruit sweeter than remembered. No misfortune befell those who had partaken of the widow's bread. Instead, the harvest proved exceptionally blessed, leaving the villagers to wonder in hushed conversations whether they had been wrong about Agatha all along. The whispers traveled faster than autumn wind. Agatha's bread, with its perfect golden crust and hint of nutmeg, had brought no misfortune, only satisfied bellies and nods of reluctant appreciation. Some even claimed their joints ached less after eating it, though such talk remained hushed behind closed doors. Matthias paced the meeting-house floor, his face contorted with rage. "This cannot stand," he declared to the assembled council members. "Silas has brought witchcraft into our valley by harboring that woman." The elder's fist crashed against the wooden table. "I demand a second trial by rope. The divine judgment must be sought again, as our ancestors have always done when evil threatens our way of life." Darla nodded vigorously from her seat near the hearth. "My customers speak of strange lights from the mountain cabin," the innkeeper added, though no one had actually reported such things. "And the bread. Who knows what she mixed into the dough? Our children could be bewitched." Across the room, Helmi shook her head, gray braids swinging with the motion. "We have no evidence of wrongdoing," the healer countered. "The bread harmed no one. In fact, old Willem's cough has improved since he took a slice." "Coincidence," Darla snapped. "Or perhaps part of their plan to lull us into trust." The council remained divided, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats while others nodded along with Matthias's accusations. Outside, rain began to patter against the shutters, as if the sky itself were weeping at the village's stubborn fear. Up on the mountainside, Agatha sat by Silas's hearth, unaware of the renewed danger. She felt strangely torn, grateful for the sanctuary she'd found, yet conscious of her growing influence over the valley's whispered conversations. For a woman who had spent years being overlooked except when blamed, this power was both terrifying and intoxicating. "They're talking about the bread," she murmured to Silas as he returned with firewood. "I can feel it." He arranged the logs carefully before answering. "Let them talk. You've done nothing wrong." "But that's never mattered before, has it?" Agatha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Matthias doesn't need truth to condemn me." Silas's face hardened. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." That night, as Agatha slept, Gregor appeared at the cabin door, his woodcutter's hands trembling as he delivered news of the council meeting. "They want another trial," he whispered, unable to meet Silas's eyes. "Matthias says the rope will decide." Silas thanked him with a silent nod, watching as the woodcutter disappeared into the darkness. Inside, Agatha's steady breathing continued, untroubled by the knowledge that once again, her fate hung in the balance of village superstition and one man's stubborn protection. The first snow of winter fell like a silent judgment, blanketing the valley and sealing the mountain passes with walls of white. Inside Silas's cabin, the crackling fire cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls as Agatha wrapped herself in thick furs against the evening chill. The isolation that had once seemed like punishment now felt strangely like protection. "My mother taught me to read the winter by the thickness of pine bark," Agatha said, her fingers working deftly as she mended one of Silas's worn shirts. "This will be long and bitter." Silas nodded, adding another log to the fire. "The bears have been gathering more than usual. They know what's coming." His usual gruffness had softened over the weeks, worn down by their shared meals and quiet evenings. Each night brought new stories. Agatha spoke of her late husband's kindness, of herbs that could heal frostbite, of recipes that could stretch meager provisions through the harshest months. Silas shared tales of mountain survival, of encounters with wolves, of stars that guided travelers home when all paths disappeared beneath snow. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Agatha admitted one evening, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "Not after they put the rope around my neck." The mountain man studied her face in the firelight, seeing strength where others had only seen size. "Some people fear what they don't understand," he replied, his calloused hand briefly touching hers before withdrawing. Meanwhile, down in the valley, Darla moved between tables at her inn, her whispers as potent as poison. "Mark my words," the innkeeper hissed to anyone who would listen. "We'll all starve before spring if that woman remains in our valley. The spirits are angry she escaped judgment." Each day brought new rumors. Crops stored for winter were rotting mysteriously. Milk was souring overnight. Children were having nightmares of a large shadow standing over their beds. None were true, but truth mattered less than fear as winter tightened its grip. Helmi tried reasoning with the villagers, reminding them that harsh winters had come and gone long before Agatha arrived. But the healer's words fell on deaf ears as Matthias encouraged the growing panic, seeing opportunity in their terror. Back in the cabin, Silas and Agatha sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth and something more complex, a connection neither could name nor deny. Outside, snow continued to fall, and with each inch the distance between them and the village seemed to shrink rather than grow, as if fate were slowly drawing them back toward a confrontation they couldn't avoid forever. "Do you ever regret standing before the rope?" Agatha asked quietly. Silas looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not once," he said. "Not for a single heartbeat." The bitter winter wind howled through the valley as Gregor trudged up the mountain path, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. Each step towards Silas's cabin felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the secret he had carried for too long. When he arrived, his face was as pale as the snow clinging to his boots. "I can't stay silent anymore," Gregor whispered, his voice breaking as Agatha offered him a steaming cup of pine needle tea. The woodcutter's hands trembled, spilling droplets onto the rough-hewn table. Matthias lied about everything. Silas leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames of the hearth. "What do you mean?" Tears welled in Gregor's eyes as he finally revealed the truth. "Your husband's death wasn't cursed, Agatha. Matthias fabricated the accusations against you because he wanted your land." He explained how the elder had coveted the fertile plot that bordered the stream, how he had manipulated the villagers' fears of widows and outsiders to drive Agatha away. "He told us your size was a sign of greed, that you had consumed your husband's life force," Gregor continued, shame coloring his features. "I knew it wasn't true, but I was too afraid to speak up." Agatha sat perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "You loved my husband as a friend. Why would you let this happen?" The woodcutter couldn't meet her gaze. "Because I loved you more." Silas paced the small cabin, fury building in his chest. This ends now. By morning, he had made his decision. With Gregor's testimony in hand, he marched down to the village, determination in every step. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Silas burst into the meeting house, Gregor trailing behind him. The mountain man's voice echoed against the wooden beams as he presented the woodcutter's confession to the assembled elders. Matthias's face contorted with rage. "You would believe the word of a lovesick fool over mine?" he snarled, but the doubt had already taken root among the council members. Helmi, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "There are records that could verify this claim. Guild documents about land ownership." The council, though still fearful of Matthias's influence, could not dismiss such serious allegations. After heated debate, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely. "The trial is postponed until the Winter Spirit Festival," announced the head counselor, his voice grave. "Then we will determine the truth once and for all." As Silas left the meeting house, he caught Matthias's venomous glare. The elder's power might be wavering, but a cornered man was at his most dangerous. The coming festival would either bring justice or disaster, and Silas knew which one Matthias would be planning for. The Winter Spirit Festival descended upon the valley like an ancient spell. Villagers emerged from their homes, wearing wooden masks carved with the faces of spirits, some benevolent, others fearsome. Torches lined the snow-covered paths leading to the village square, their flames dancing wildly against the twilight sky, casting long shadows that seemed to move with minds of their own. Children ran through the square with bells tied to their wrists, the jingling meant to ward off malevolent mountain spirits. The air smelled of pine smoke, mulled cider, and the distinctive scent of ritual herbs that Helmi had prepared for the occasion. Beneath the revelers' feet, frost crackled with each step, nature's own percussion accompanying the chants that grew louder as night fell. "Spirits of winter, hear our call," the villagers sang in unison, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Judge the wicked, spare the just." Matthias stood tall in his ceremonial furs, a mask of twisted wood covering his features, making him appear more demon than man. The elder raised his hands, and the crowd fell silent. "Bring forth the accused," he commanded, his voice carrying across the hushed square. From the edge of the gathering, Agatha appeared, her wrists bound with coarse rope. 2 guild members flanked her, guiding her toward the ancient oak that had witnessed generations of the valley's harshest judgments. The widow walked with surprising dignity, despite her bonds, her face betraying neither fear nor resignation. The crowd parted before her, some averting their eyes, while others stared with undisguised hostility. Darla stood near the front, her mask pushed up to reveal her satisfied smile. The innkeeper had spent weeks ensuring the village remembered every superstition about widows and curses, her whispers as potent as any poison. As Agatha was positioned beneath the oak, the hanging rope swayed ominously in the winter wind. Its dark silhouette against the torchlit sky resembled a serpent poised to strike. "The council has summoned us to witness judgment," Matthias intoned. "The accused has—" Before he could finish, a disturbance rippled through the crowd. Silas pushed his way forward, his tall frame unmistakable even among the masked figures. The mountain man wore no disguise, his face bare to the cold and to judgment. Without hesitation, he positioned himself between Agatha and the rope, just as he had done months before. "This ends tonight," he declared, his voice carrying the strength of the mountains themselves. The crowd murmured, uncertain. Some reached for their protective charms, while others exchanged nervous glances. Helmi watched from nearby, her eyes reflecting both concern and hope. Silas stood immovable as stone, a human barrier between accusation and punishment, tradition and injustice. The festival's celebratory atmosphere transformed into something more tense, more consequential, a moment when the valley's future hung as precariously as the rope above them. The rope creaked against the ancient oak, swaying in the bitter winter wind that cut through the valley like a knife. Frost glittered on the hemp, catching the light of the torches that surrounded the village square. Matthias stood tall, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames as he raised his hands to command silence from the assembled villagers. "Tonight, we fulfill our sacred duty," the elder proclaimed, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "The widow has brought misfortune upon our lands, and the rope shall be her judge." Agatha stood beneath the oak, her shoulders squared despite the weight of the accusations. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, surveyed the faces of those who had once been her neighbors. Some looked away, unable to meet her gaze, while others stared with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Before Matthias could signal for the judgment to proceed, Silas stepped forward. The mountain man moved with deliberate purpose, positioning his body directly between Agatha and the dangling noose. His stance was immovable, feet planted firmly in the frozen earth, arms crossed over his chest. "You'll have to move me first," he declared, voice low but carrying across the square. The challenge in his words was unmistakable, daring anyone to test his resolve. Matthias's face contorted with rage. "This is not your place, outsider. Step aside or face judgment yourself." Silas didn't flinch. "I stand for justice, not your twisted traditions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several villagers exchanged uncertain glances, their conviction wavering. Gregor the woodcutter stepped halfway forward before retreating back into the anonymity of the gathering. Helmi watched from the edge, her knowing eyes taking in every detail of the confrontation. "The law of our ancestors demands," Matthias began, but his words faltered as he noticed the shifting mood of the villagers. "Your law or your greed?" Silas interrupted, his question hanging in the air like the visible breath from his lips. The torchlight cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground as the standoff continued. Children clung to their parents' legs, sensing the tension that gripped the square. Darla pushed her way to the front, her face flushed with indignation. "Don't let him mock our ways," the innkeeper shouted, but her voice lacked its usual power to sway the crowd. The villagers remained frozen in place, caught between generations of tradition and the uncomfortable truth that stood before them. A solitary man willing to risk everything for someone they had cast aside. Some lowered their torches, the fire in their hearts dimming with doubt. Agatha reached out, her fingers brushing Silas's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude that did not go unnoticed. The simple touch seemed to strengthen his resolve even further. The moment stretched, taut as the rope itself, with neither side willing to yield. Ancient custom clashed with awakening conscience, and in that suspended moment, the future of the valley hung in the balance. The winter air grew still as Helmi stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered hands clutching a yellowed parchment. The folk healer's voice, usually soft when mixing remedies, now carried across the square with unexpected authority. "Before you condemn this woman," Helmi declared, unrolling the guild record with deliberate care, "you should know what truly lies behind these accusations." Her fingers traced the faded ink as villagers craned their necks to see. This document shows Agatha's husband owed Matthias a parcel of land before his death, land that would pass to his widow. Matthias lunged forward, his face contorting. "That record means nothing. The widow is cursed." "The only curse here," Helmi continued, undeterred, "is the curse of greed." She held the parchment higher, so torchlight illuminated the signatures. Matthias fabricated accusations to claim what he couldn't legally take. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. Villagers exchanged glances, their certainty crumbling like frost under morning sun. The elder's face paled as he recognized his carefully constructed narrative unraveling thread by thread. Agatha stood straighter beneath the ancient oak, her eyes fixed on the document that vindicated her. Tears streamed silently down her face, not of fear now, but of long-denied justice finally taking form. "I've kept these records since before most of you were born," the healer explained, her voice softening. "Every debt, every agreement passes through the guild's ledger. Matthias knew this, but counted on our fear to blind us to the truth." Silas remained positioned protectively before Agatha, but his stance shifted from defiance to triumph. The mountain man's weathered face broke into a rare smile as he watched understanding dawn across the faces around them. "She never cursed our crops," a farmer muttered from the back. "Or brought the drought," added another. Darla, the innkeeper, shrank back, her earlier venom replaced by the dawning horror of complicity. Nearby, Soren discreetly tucked his protective charms into his coat, sensing the market for superstition had suddenly collapsed. The rope swayed emptily in the breeze, its purpose forgotten as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Neighbors turned to one another, piecing together years of manipulated fears and baseless accusations. For the first time since accusations began, villagers looked at Agatha not with suspicion, but with the uncomfortable recognition of their own misguided judgment. "All this time," a woman whispered, "we nearly hanged her for someone else's greed." The tide of sympathy shifted visibly as Matthias backed away, his authority dissolving with each step. The spell of superstition had broken, shattered by the simple truth inked on parchment and the courage of those who refused to remain silent. The square fell silent as Gregor stepped forward, his woodcutter's hands trembling at his sides. The torchlight caught the sheen of sweat on his brow as he positioned himself between the crowd and Agatha. "I've brought her flour and firewood in secret," Gregor confessed, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I've loved Agatha since before her husband passed, though I never acted on it. I was too afraid, not of her, but of you all." The villagers exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably as the woodcutter continued. "I watched you mock her size, her widowhood. I said nothing when Matthias claimed she was cursed. My silence makes me as guilty as those who threw stones." Agatha's eyes widened, her hands clutching the borrowed furs around her shoulders. She had never suspected the depth of Gregor's feelings, his quiet devotion hidden beneath timid glances and hurried deliveries in the forest. "She bakes bread that blesses our harvest," the woodcutter continued, gaining confidence. "She predicts storms that save our crops, yet we treat her like poison among us." Several villagers nodded, remembering the sweet taste of the nutmeg loaves they had secretly accepted. Others recalled fields saved by timely warnings of frost. The tide of opinion visibly shifted as Gregor spoke of Agatha's kindness, her knowledge, her heart. Matthias stepped forward, his authority visibly crumbling. "You forget yourself, woodcutter," he snarled, "and you all forget the danger of outsiders." He pointed accusingly at Silas. "This mountain man has no place in our decisions. He knows nothing of our ways, our traditions." The elder's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "Will you let a stranger and a lovesick fool decide the future of our valley?" To his evident shock, the answer came in murmurs of dissent. Darla tried to rally support from her usual gossip circle, but even they stepped back, unwilling to stand with the exposed liar. "I may be a stranger," Silas said, his deep voice carrying across the square, "but I know justice when I see it, and I know greed." He gestured toward Matthias. "This man wanted her land, nothing more." The council members exchanged knowing glances. One by one, they turned away from Matthias, their allegiance dissolving like morning frost. Gregor moved to Agatha's side, finally daring to take her hand in his. "I should have spoken sooner," he whispered. She squeezed his fingers gently. "You spoke when it mattered most." Across the square, Matthias stood alone, his face contorted with rage and humiliation as he watched decades of influence evaporate before his eyes. The rope that had threatened Agatha now seemed like a symbol of his own fate, his power strangled by truth, dangling uselessly in the winter wind. The council members stood in a solemn semicircle beneath the ancient oak, their faces grave as they delivered their verdict. Agatha stood with her head high, the chains that had once bound her wrists now lying discarded on the frozen ground. "We find no evidence of curse or wrongdoing," announced the eldest council member, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "Agatha's land and rights as a widow are hereby restored in full." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the gathered villagers. Some looked away in shame, others nodded in quiet acceptance. The large woman, who had endured their scorn for so long, remained composed, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The land that had belonged to her husband would remain hers, the small cottage with its herb garden and the western field that caught the last light of day. Helmi approached first, clasping Agatha's hands in her own. "The old ways teach us that justice finds its path, even through the deepest snow," the healer whispered. Others followed cautiously, a nod here, a mumbled apology there. The widow accepted each gesture with quiet dignity, neither gloating nor bitter. Across the square, Silas leaned against the wall of the meeting house, watching the proceedings with guarded satisfaction. The mountain man had no interest in accolades, but villagers approached him nonetheless, offering awkward thanks or respectful nods. A group of young woodcutters even invited him to join their guild properly, an offer that would have been unthinkable mere weeks before. "You've earned your place here," Gregor told him, the woodcutter's early timidity replaced with earnest gratitude. "Should you want it?" Silas merely grunted in response, but something in his posture had softened. The valley that had once seemed merely a place to trade furs and gather supplies now held something more. Connections, however tentative. That evening, as torches were lit around the square, Agatha walked freely among her neighbors. Children who had once been warned away now watched her with curious eyes rather than fear. The widow shared her bread with those who approached, each piece a silent reconciliation. "They'll remember this winter," Helmi remarked, watching the scene unfold. How truth melted falsehood like spring sun on ice. As darkness settled over the valley, Agatha caught Silas's eye across the gathering. A wordless understanding passed between them, neither fully accepted, perhaps, but no longer alone in their otherness. The community that had nearly destroyed them now cautiously welcomed them, the wounds of suspicion beginning to heal under the gentle bandage of truth. The bells that had once summoned judgment now rang to mark the evening hour, their sound transformed from ominous to ordinary in the crisp mountain air. The morning after the Winter Spirit Festival, Matthias Eldridge was nowhere to be seen in the village square. His door remained shut, curtains drawn against curious eyes. The once powerful elder, who had commanded respect with a mere glance, now skulked through back alleys when necessity forced him outdoors. Children who had once fallen silent at his approach now whispered and pointed, their fear replaced by something worse, ridicule. "He passes his days counting coins that no longer multiply," remarked one villager to another, their voices no longer hushed in deference. The revelation of his greed had stained his reputation beyond repair. The meeting house, once his domain, elected Tomas the blacksmith to lead the council instead, a man known for his straightforward speech and lack of hidden motives. At Darla's Inn, the usual evening crowd had thinned considerably. The innkeeper found herself serving ale in uncomfortable silence, where once animated gossip had flowed freely. Her establishment, previously buzzing with whispered accusations and fearful speculation, now echoed with mundane talk of weather and crops. When she attempted to revive old rumors about Agatha, patrons would change the subject or quietly settle their tabs and leave. "Business isn't what it was," she complained to the few regulars who remained loyal. "People have short memories." But the truth was simpler. The villagers had not forgotten, but had finally recognized the poison in her words. Soren the merchant, ever attuned to shifting winds of profit, packed his wagon within a week of the trial's conclusion. His protective charms, once sought after with desperate coin, lay unwanted in wooden boxes. "The northern villages are more appreciative of my wares," he announced to anyone who would listen. By midday, his cart had disappeared over the ridge, following opportunity to more superstitious territories. Meanwhile, Helmi's small cottage became a place of increased traffic. Villagers who had once avoided the healer's gaze now sought her counsel not just for ailments but for disputes and decisions. Her defense of Agatha, once deemed foolish, was recast as the wisdom of someone who could see truth when others were blinded by fear. "You knew all along," a farmer's wife said to her while collecting a remedy for winter cough. "I knew only what my conscience told me," Helmi replied, measuring dried herbs with careful fingers. "As did you, though perhaps more quietly." Throughout the valley, the fractures began to heal. Families who had stood on opposite sides during Agatha's persecution cautiously resumed trade and conversation. Children played together again across previously drawn lines. The healing was not immediate. Trust once broken mends slowly. But with each passing day, the village breathed more easily, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The last of the winter snow melted slowly along the valley's edge, revealing patches of green beneath the white blanket. For the first time in many seasons, Silas had not retreated to his solitary existence high in the mountains. Instead, many things happened. He found himself lingering in the valley, drawn to the community that had once shunned him as fiercely as they had Agatha. In the soft glow of the hearth fire, Agatha and Silas sat side by side in comfortable silence. Her hands worked deftly at mending a torn shirt, while he whittled a small wooden figure. The widow's cabin, once a place of isolation, now felt like home to them both. Villagers occasionally stopped by with small offerings, a jar of preserves from Helmi, freshly cut timber from Gregor. Tentative gestures of acceptance after the winter's revelations. "Spring will be here soon," Agatha said, her voice soft as she set aside her needlework. "Will you return to your cabin in the mountains?" Silas paused, the knife still against the wood. He had asked himself this question many times over the past weeks. The mountains had been his refuge for so long, but now they seemed cold and empty compared to the warmth he had found here. "I thought I might stay," he replied, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "At least until the summer festivals." Agatha smiled, the firelight catching the silver strands in her dark hair. "The valley feels different now, lighter somehow." They fell silent again, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars pricking the darkness above the valley that had witnessed so much change. As the fire burned low, Agatha turned to him, her expression serious. "I never told you something, Silas. I never truly feared the rope." The mountain man looked up, puzzled. "3 nights before they came for me," she continued, "I dreamed of a tall figure standing between me and death. A mountain man with eyes like yours, placing himself before the noose." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "When you appeared in the square that day, it was as if I had summoned you from my dreams." Silas's hands stilled completely. The wooden figure, a small carving of an oak tree, sat forgotten in his palm. "You dreamed of me before we met?" Agatha nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Perhaps it was fate that brought you to the square that day, not merely justice." The revelation settled around him like a mantle of snow, both chilling and comforting. Had he truly acted of his own will, or had some greater force drawn him to her? The woodcarver's knife trembled slightly in his weathered hand. "Fate or choice," he finally said. "I would stand between you and that rope again." Years later, the villagers still spoke of that winter when justice hung in the balance beneath the ancient oak. The story of Agatha and Silas became woven into the valley's folklore, passed down from elders to children as they gathered around hearth fires on cold nights. What began as a tale of persecution transformed into a legend of courage that changed their community forever. The widow stood tall, even when they wanted her small. Mothers would tell their daughters, no longer whispering Agatha's name in fear, but speaking it with reverence. Her physical size, once mocked, became a symbol of her unbreakable spirit. The villagers watched as she rebuilt her life, tending her reclaimed land with the same hands that had baked the bread that fed them through winter's darkest days. Silas, though never fully embracing village life, no longer lived in complete isolation. The mountain man who once valued solitude above all else now understood the worth of connection. He still spent most days in his cabin, but would appear at festivals and gatherings, his silent presence a reminder of what standing for another could accomplish. Children who once feared his scowl now sought his rare smiles, knowing the strength in his hands had saved rather than harmed. Even the meeting house changed. Where Matthias once ruled with suspicion and fear, a council now governed with caution and fairness. Helmi's voice carried weight in these gatherings, her wisdom recognized after years of being dismissed. The folk healer ensured that old traditions were examined rather than blindly followed, separating superstition from genuine community needs. Gregor and Agatha built a life together that defied expectations. The woodcutter who once delivered flour and firewood in secret now proudly walked beside his wife through the village square. Their home became known for its warmth and hospitality, a place where both valley-born and travelers could find welcome. When spring finally arrived that year, the bells that had once summoned villagers to witness punishment rang instead to celebrate new beginnings. The sound echoed differently now, not as a call to judgment, but as a reminder that courage could break chains forged by generations of fear. As wildflowers pushed through melting snow around the ancient oak, the villagers understood what Silas had known instinctively that fateful night. Sometimes the bravest act is simply standing between cruelty and its target, refusing to move despite tradition's weight. And sometimes, in that single moment of defiance, an entire community can find its way back to compassion.